I was meant to be completely invisible. A nameless maid scrubbing the freezing stone floors of the Silver Peak fortress. He was the undisputed alpha, a towering, heavily scarred force of raw destruction. We were never supposed to collide. But the night I shattered his poisoned wine to save his life, the ancient rules burned away. I expected the executioner's blade. I never expected the ruthless king to fall to his knees, slide the ancient royal ring onto my trembling finger, and vow to burn the entire kingdom to ashes if anyone ever touched me again. Welcome to Luna's secret library. Sometimes the most unexpected turns lead us exactly where we need to be. What happens next is something I never saw coming, and I think you'll find it just as surprising. Stick around for the conclusion. It's a reminder that it's never too late for a new chapter. If you enjoy discovering these hidden gems, I'd be honored to have you follow for more. The heavy oak doors of the great hall slammed shut against the biting winter wind. Emily stood trembling in the shadows with a silver tray pressed against her chest. She was nothing but a lowly servant in the ancient stone fortress of the Silver Peak Pack. Her youth and quiet beauty usually kept her invisible among the rough warriors. Tonight, however, invisibility felt like a terrifying curse. Alpha Ethan sat at the head of the massive banquet table. He was a towering figure of raw and untamed power. His broad, muscular shoulders strained against his formal leather tunic. Short, sharply cut dark hair framed a face hardened by years of brutal warfare. He had just returned victorious from the perilous northern borders. The entire pack gathered tonight to celebrate his bloody triumph over the rogue armies. Yet, a deadly silence had thickened the air in the kitchens just moments ago. Emily had seen something she was never meant to witness. Luna Victoria, a woman of cold and ruthless elegance, had slipped a vial of pale liquid into the king's personal chalice. It was liquid silver mixed with concentrated wolfsbane. This was a lethal poison potent enough to drop even the strongest alpha in mere seconds. Now, Victoria smiled flawlessly as she offered the jeweled goblet to her unsuspecting mate. Ethan reached out with a scarred and battle-weary hand. His piercing amber eyes held no suspicion for the woman bound to him by sacred pack law. Emily's heart hammered furiously against her ribs. She knew the ancient laws and the penalty for a servant interrupting a royal toast. It was an immediate and painful execution without trial. But the thought of the Alpha King dying before her eyes tore straight through her paralyzing terror. He was known as a harsh ruler, but he always fiercely protected the weak within his territory. Victoria only cared for absolute power and the royal bloodline she desperately wished to control. The jeweled goblet finally touched Ethan's lips. Emily moved completely on instinct before her mind could catch up. She lunged forward from the dark alcove. Her delicate feet practically flew across the freezing stone floor. "Don't drink." Her desperate voice tore through the massive hall like a sudden crack of thunder. Hundreds of deadly werewolf warriors turned their glowing eyes toward the small girl. Emily refused to stop her reckless momentum. She crashed violently into the side of the Alpha's carved chair. Her slender hand slammed upward into the heavy gold goblet. The harsh impact sent the cup flying out of the king's grip. It hit the stone floor with a deafening metallic clang that echoed off the vaulted ceiling. Dark red wine splashed across the ancient grey slabs like freshly spilled blood. Instantly, the tainted liquid began to hiss and bubble furiously against the stone. A foul and acrid smoke curled upward toward the chandeliers. The unmistakable stench of burning silver filled the great hall. A deathly, suffocating silence fell over the entire room. Not a single wolf dared to breathe. Emily fell hard to her knees. Her petite body was shaking uncontrollably from the sudden adrenaline crash. She immediately kept her head bowed, exposing her fragile neck in an ultimate display of pack submission. A low, terrifying growl rumbled from deep within Alpha Ethan's broad chest. It was a primal sound that promised absolute destruction to anyone who crossed him. The temperature in the room seemed to plummet dramatically below freezing. Emily felt the immense weight of his dominant alpha aura crashing down upon her shoulders. She squeezed her eyes tightly shut, preparing for the fatal blow. Instead, the heavy thud of leather boots stepped slowly around the wooden table. Ethan stopped right in front of her trembling form. He stared intensely down at the violently sizzling puddle of poisoned wine. Then, his piercing gaze shifted slowly to the pale girl on the floor. Luna Victoria stood utterly frozen nearby. Her flawless aristocratic mask finally cracked with genuine panic. "Seize this wretched maid!" Victoria shrieked, her voice shrill with sudden desperation. "She has deliberately ruined the king's sacred victory toast." Two massive royal guards stepped forward instantly with their claws extending to grab Emily. "Halt!" Ethan's voice was dangerously quiet, yet it carried absolute authority. The heavily armed guards froze instantly mid-step. Ethan slowly crouched down until his massive frame was completely at eye level with the young servant. His sheer size easily blocked out the rest of the crowded hall from her view. He slowly reached out a large and calloused hand. His rough fingers gently tilted Emily's chin upward. She was forced to look directly into the glowing amber depths of the Alpha King's eyes. There was no murderous rage directed at her. Instead, there was only a burning and intense curiosity. "You just saved my life, little one," he whispered. His deep voice sent a hot shiver straight down her spine. Victoria took a stumbling step backward away from the royal dais. The entire political game of the kingdom had completely changed in a fraction of a second. Emily swallowed hard, her fiercely resilient spirit fighting through the overwhelming wave of fear. She had miraculously survived the night. But she had just made the most dangerous enemy in the entire realm. The Alpha King slowly stood up, his protective gaze never leaving Emily's face. The real war for survival had just begun within the walls of the Silver Peak fortress. The heavy silence in the Great Hall was suddenly broken by a sharp and desperate laugh. Luna Victoria pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at Emily. "Are you truly going to believe this filthy servant over your own mated wife, Ethan?" Her voice echoed with a toxic mix of sudden panic and manufactured outrage. "She clearly brought the poison herself in a pathetic attempt to assassinate you." The surrounding pack members began to murmur anxiously among themselves. Victoria's aristocratic family was incredibly powerful across the Northern Territories. Open defiance against the reigning Luna was an entirely unprecedented and dangerous event. Emily remained kneeling on the freezing stone floor. Her fragile heart was pounding frantically against her ribs like a trapped bird. She knew she had absolutely no physical proof to support her desperate actions. It was merely her lowly word against the highest-ranking female in the entire kingdom. Alpha Ethan did not immediately respond to his wife's hysterical and wild accusations. His tall, commanding, and heavily muscular frame slowly straightened to its full height. He ran a large, scarred hand firmly through his short dark hair. His piercing amber eyes remained fixed intently on the bubbling puddle of ruined wine. The acrid and sickening smell of burning wolfsbane still heavily tainted the frigid air. Ethan possessed the absolute sharpest predatory senses of any wolf in the Silver Peak pack. He closed his eyes for just a fraction of a second and inhaled deeply through his nose. He could instantly smell the cloying, sickly sweet scent of deep deception pouring off Victoria. Underneath her expensive floral perfume, the distinct metallic tang of pure guilt was undeniable. Then, the Alpha shifted his intense focus downward to the trembling girl at his boots. From Emily, he smelled only pure, unfiltered terror mixed with an undeniable fierce honesty. There was not a single trace of malice, dark ambition, or betrayal in her delicate scent. Instead, she smelled faintly of wild winter berries and the fresh pine needles of the deep forest. It was an incredibly soothing fragrance that strangely and instantly calmed the raging beast within his chest. "Silence," Ethan commanded softly. His deep, rumbling voice sliced through the chaotic hall whispers like a physical steel blade. The entire massive room instantly obeyed the sheer, crushing power of his dominant alpha tone. Victoria visibly flinched as if she had been violently struck across the face by his word. The poison was already burning in my chalice long before this girl ever approached the dais, Ethan stated coldly. He slowly turned his heavy, predatory gaze toward his fiercely ambitious wife. I smelled the foul taint the exact moment she shattered the jeweled cup, Victoria. The Luna's beautiful face drained of all healthy color in an instant. She was left looking completely hollow and utterly terrified beneath the blazing chandeliers. You dare accuse me of this treason? She shrieked, her flawless composure shattering into pieces. I am your chosen Luna. You are now a prime suspect in high treason, Ethan corrected her mercilessly. His tone was now absolutely void of any previous marital warmth or expected mercy. He raised his hand and motioned sharply to his elite personal guards standing in the shadows. These were a group of massive, lethal warriors who were loyal only to his direct bloodline. Escort the Luna to the isolated high tower and confine her there immediately. No one is to enter or leave her presence without my express, direct, and personal command. Victoria began to scream and thrash wildly as the heavily armed guards quickly surrounded her. She hurled vicious, ancient curses at Ethan and spat venomous death threats toward the young maid. Emily kept her head bowed low, desperately trying to make herself as small and invisible as possible. The heavy wooden doors of the great hall slammed shut once again. The loud thud completely cut off Victoria's frantic, echoing screams from the grand room. The remaining aristocratic lords and hardened warriors stood completely paralyzed in the sudden quiet. Ethan looked back down at Emily. His notoriously hard and ruthless expression was visibly softening into something strangely protective. He reached down deliberately with his strong, battle-scarred hands. His rough fingers gently grasped her fragile upper arms. With totally effortless strength, he lifted her straight off the freezing stone floor. He pulled her up until she was standing fully upright before his massive chest. Her small, delicate hands instinctively rested against his thick leather tunic for crucial balance. She could clearly feel the steady, powerful, and reassuring beating of his heart beneath the armor. "What is your name, little brave savior?" he asked. His voice had dropped to a low, intimate rumble that vibrated pleasantly through her palms. "Emily, my king," she whispered softly. Her voice was shaking terribly despite her desperate, inward efforts to stay brave and composed. "Well, Emily, you can no longer return to the unprotected servants' quarters tonight." He looked fiercely around the massive hall. His glowing amber eyes dared absolutely anyone to object to his next monumental decision. "From this exact moment forward, this girl is under my absolute and personal royal protection." A collective, shocked gasp quickly rippled through the gathered elite members of the pack. "Anyone who dares to harm a single hair on her delicate head will answer directly to my claws." He did not wait for any murmurs of agreement or cowardly dissent from his stunned subjects. Ethan firmly and securely wrapped his large, warm hand around Emily's incredibly delicate wrist. He turned his broad back on the silent crowd and began to lead her away from the ruined banquet. He was pulling her directly away from the toxic political nightmare her brave action had just triggered. Emily stumbled slightly over her simple dress. Her exhausted mind was completely unable to process this sudden, massive shift in her harsh reality. She had fully expected to be brutally and swiftly executed for her reckless disruption just minutes ago. Instead, she was now being personally escorted away by the most powerful, dangerous man in the realm. They walked quietly together through the dark, echoing stone corridors of the heavily fortified castle. The massive Alpha King kept a surprisingly slow and deliberate pace. He was silently ensuring she could easily keep up with his naturally long and powerful strides. He led her straight up the grand spiraling marble staircase. They were heading directly toward the strictly forbidden and heavily guarded royal residential wing. Emily knew perfectly well that no ordinary servant was ever allowed past the heavy iron gates of this top floor. Ethan easily pushed open a massive, intricately carved wooden door at the end of the hall. He gently but firmly ushered her inside the vast, private space. It was his personal bedchamber. The room was filled with immense, comforting warmth, a roaring crackling fire, and the heavy, intoxicating scent of his pure dominance. "You are entirely safe here," Ethan finally said. He slowly released her fragile wrist but purposefully stayed close enough to catch her if she finally collapsed. Emily stood frozen in the very center of the opulent, oversized room. She was feeling entirely out of place and deeply overwhelmed by the sudden intimacy of the situation. The Alpha King watched her intently from the shadows. The primal, possessive curiosity in his golden eyes was currently burning much brighter than the hearth fire. The vicious, deadly game of pack survival had just completely rewritten all of its ancient rules tonight. The heavy oak door of the Alpha King's private bedchamber clicked shut, firmly sealing them off from the chaotic political storm currently raging throughout the Silver Peak fortress. The room was vast and steeped in rugged masculinity, dominated by a massive stone hearth where a roaring fire cast flickering, high-contrast shadows across the ancient tapestries. Ethan stood silently by the heavy iron grate. The warm firelight perfectly highlighted his tall, intensely muscular frame and the sharp, military cut of his short dark hair. He slowly unbuckled his heavy leather war belt, letting it drop to the stone floor with a muted thud. The sheer size of the man in such an enclosed space was overwhelming, yet Emily felt a strange, inexplicable sense of safety radiating from him. She remained hovering near the entryway, her slender fingers nervously clutching the fabric of her simple, worn servant's dress. "You are bleeding," Ethan stated suddenly. His deep, gravelly voice sliced cleanly through the crackling silence of the room. He closed the physical distance between them with a terrifyingly graceful predator's stride, moving entirely too fast for a man of his immense bulk. Before Emily could protest or even examine herself, he reached out and gently caught her left arm. A harsh, purplish bruise was already blooming vividly across her delicate forearm, and a small trickle of crimson ran down from a sharp cut on her palm, a direct consequence of her reckless dive against his heavily carved wooden chair. The Alpha King's amber eyes darkened instantly as he stared at the small wound. The faint metallic scent of her human blood hit the warm air, but it did not trigger the vicious bloodlust of a wolf. Instead, it ignited a fiercely protective, primal instinct deep within his chest. Without speaking another word, Ethan guided her gently toward a plush velvet armchair positioned near the warmth of the hearth, pressing down lightly on her shoulder until she surrendered her weight and Saturday. He walked purposefully over to a heavy oak wash basin, pouring warm water from an iron kettle, and quickly returned with a clean white linen cloth. Kneeling directly before her, the mighty ruler of the Northern Territories, a man who ruthlessly commanded thousands of lethal, bloodthirsty warriors, carefully began to wipe the dried blood from the hands of a lowly maid. The extreme visual contrast between his massively battle-scarred, calloused hands and her fragile, youthful skin was profoundly moving. Emily watched him with wide, tear-sheened eyes, thoroughly mesmerized by the intensely focused gentleness of his touch. He was treating her not like a disposable, insignificant servant who had merely performed her duty, but like something infinitely precious and delicate that could shatter at any moment. "Why did you do it, Emily?" he asked quietly, his intense gaze remaining focused on the small cut as he wiped the dirt away with agonizing care. "You knew the absolute penalty for interrupting a royal gathering. You knew Victoria would immediately try to have you publicly slaughtered for your insolence. You possess no wolf strength to defend yourself against the guards. You are purely human. So why risk everything for a ruthless alpha you barely even know?" Emily swallowed hard against the tight knot of anxiety in her throat, drawing upon the deep, hidden well of resilience that had kept her alive in this brutal world of shifting allegiances. "You are a harsh king to your sworn enemies, my alpha, but you are never cruel to the weak and defenseless. I have seen you order extra grain to be sent to the human villages during the deep winter freeze. I have secretly watched you pardon low-ranking wolves who stole meat out of genuine hunger. Victoria, she only cares for the throne, the royal bloodline, and her own insatiable vanity. If she had successfully killed you tonight, the entire territory would have drowned in innocent blood. I could not stand back in the shadows and watch a good man die for the dark ambition of a wicked woman. Ethan immediately stopped his ministrations, his rough hands slowly encompassing her small, trembling ones. He tilted his handsome head, letting those brightly glowing amber eyes lock entirely onto hers. There was a raw, unfiltered vulnerability in her honest words that struck him much harder than any physical blow ever could on a battlefield. For years, he had been constantly surrounded by deceitful sycophants, hidden assassins, and power-hungry aristocratic lords. His own mated wife had just attempted to burn his insides out with concentrated wolfsbane. Yet here sat a young, beautiful girl with absolutely nothing to her name, possessing far more honor, loyalty, and sheer courage than his entire royal court combined. He slowly reached up, his thumb gently brushing a stray lock of dark hair behind her ear. The radiating heat of his masculine skin sent a sudden, electric jolt straight through her veins, stealing the breath from her lungs. Suddenly, the intimate, charged quiet of the bedchamber was violently shattered. Ethan went completely rigid, his head snapping toward the thick stone walls as his pupils dilated entirely into pure black pools. A low, incredibly menacing growl vibrated deep within his broad chest, shaking the very air around them. Emily gasped, shrinking back slightly as the terrifying, dominant aura of the enraged Alpha King flooded the room once more. He wasn't looking at the wooden door, he was intensely listening to a desperate, telepathic mind link flooding in from his elite royal guard stationed at the outer gates. Victoria's loyalists are making their move, Ethan growled, his voice turning into pure gravel as he smoothly stood up to his full, towering height. Her family's guard captain is attempting to violently rally the eastern barracks under the false guise of rescuing their Luna from an unlawful and tyrannical imprisonment. He turned back to Emily, his expression hardening back into the terrifying mask of the ruthless warlord he was forced to be to maintain the peace. He strode over to his massive, fur-lined royal bed and decisively threw back the heavy velvet blankets. Get in. You will stay exactly in the center of this bed until I return. You are not to open the door for anyone but me, do you understand? Emily scrambled up from the chair, her heart pounding frantically against her ribs once again as panic threatened to overtake her. But what about you? They have fully armed armies out there, Ethan. She stopped dead, utterly horrified that she had just addressed the fearsome king by his first name without using his proper title. But Ethan merely paused and smiled, a dark, impossibly dangerous, and thrillingly confident smirk that promised absolute ruin to all of his approaching enemies. He walked over to the stone wall and drew a massive, lethal silver broadsword from the iron rack, the polished metal gleaming coldly in the flickering firelight. Let them come with all their traitorous armies, Ethan said softly, his golden eyes flashing with a lethal, predatory anticipation that sent a shiver down her spine. They are about to learn exactly why I am the undisputed reigning alpha of the Silver Peak Pack. Sleep safely in my bed, my brave girl. The rogue wolves will certainly howl tonight, but I swear on my life that no harm will ever reach you. The heavy wooden door closed with a resounding click, leaving Emily completely alone in the massive bedchamber. The roaring fire in the massive stone hearth cast stark, high-contrast shadows against the ancient walls, turning the room into an intense theater of dramatic light and dark. She sat dead center on the enormous fur-lined bed, clutching the heavy velvet blankets tightly to her chest. Her heart hammered a frantic, painful rhythm against her ribs. Even through the thick, impenetrable fortress walls, the terrifying sounds of the gathering storm outside reached her ears. Snarls, the heavy clash of steel, and the violent thud of combat boots echoed relentlessly down the grand corridor. She knew Ethan was out there, facing an entire angry faction of armed warriors entirely on his own. The logical part of her mind screamed that no single man, not even an alpha king, could survive such overwhelming odds without his personal army. Yet, the vivid memory of his absolute, chilling confidence in his towering, muscular frame firmly anchored her panic. Outside the isolated royal wing, the grand marble hallway was tightly packed with victorious treasonous guards. The rebel captain, a massive and heavily scarred wolf with bristling grey fur, bared his lethal teeth at the lone figure standing between them and the king's private chambers. Ethan did not even bother to summon his own elite royal guard for backup. He stood casually blocking the heavy oak door, his short dark hair absorbing the dim torchlight, his broad and heavily muscled shoulders easily filling the entire archway. His polished silver broadsword hung loosely from his right hand. He did not look like a desperate man facing a deadly armed rebellion. He looked exactly like a terrifying apex predator who had just found his helpless prey. "Step aside, Ethan," the rebel captain sneered, his gravelly voice deeply distorted by his aggressive partial transformation. "You have unlawfully and brutally imprisoned our reigning Luna. The powerful Eastern barracks will absolutely not stand for this blatant insult. Hand over the wretched human girl who poisoned the royal cup, and we might be merciful enough to let you live through the night." A low, aggressively vibrating growl ripped violently from Ethan's throat, shaking the very dust from the vaulted stone ceiling above them. He did not waste his breath on useless diplomacy or diplomatic lies. With a sudden, explosive burst of terrifying speed, he launched himself forward. He did not even need to shift into his monstrous wolf form. His raw, unmatched human strength was more than enough to handle traitors. His heavy silver blade moved like a blinding flash of lightning in the confined space. In a matter of agonizing seconds, the arrogant captain was slammed hard onto the floor, completely disarmed and bleeding heavily from a deep, non-fatal wound to his shoulder. The remaining guards froze in absolute, paralyzing horror. They had briefly forgotten exactly why Ethan was the undisputed, blood-soaked ruler of the brutal North. He was not just a king, he was a pure, unstoppable force of violent destruction. "Does anyone else wish to challenge my rule tonight?" Ethan asked quietly. His deep voice was perfectly calm, but his brightly glowing amber eyes promised a slow and incredibly painful death to any man who dared to take another step forward. "If you truly wish to die for a traitorous, deceitful woman who openly attempted to murder your reigning king, step forward right now. Otherwise, drop your weapons instantly and return to your assigned posts. You have exactly 3 seconds to make your final decision." The sharp, metallic clatter of dropping swords immediately filled the grand hallway. The foolish rebellion was utterly crushed before it could even truly begin. Ethan watched them scramble away in retreat, his handsome face a terrifying mask of cold, unforgiving stone. He calmly ordered a small, fiercely loyal detachment of his personal guards to secure the outer perimeter, ensuring absolutely no one would dare to disturb the remainder of the night. Back inside the warm chamber, Emily flinched violently as the heavy oak door slowly opened. She held her breath, entirely terrified of who might walk through the frame. But it was Ethan. He stepped inside and quietly locked the heavy iron bolt behind him. The harsh scent of fresh blood and cold winter rain clung to his tall frame heavily. He paused immediately near the entrance, deliberately keeping a massive distance between himself and the bed. He knew exactly how terrifying and savage he must look to a delicate human girl. His dark leather tunic was torn at the shoulder, and dark crimson stains heavily marked his muscular arms and his gleaming silver blade. He placed the bloody weapon carefully on the iron rack and began to strip off his ruined leather armor. Emily watched in breathless silence as the flickering firelight danced beautifully across his heavily scarred, deeply muscular chest. He poured fresh, warm water into the heavy iron wash basin and began to vigorously scrub the thick blood from his skin. The stark, emotional contrast between the brutal violence he had just committed outside and the quiet, incredibly careful way he now washed his hands struck her deeply in her soul. He was meticulously washing away the horrors of war so he would not frighten her with his true, savage nature. When he was finally clean, he walked slowly and deliberately toward the edge of the bed. He did not climb in to claim the space. He simply sat down on the very edge, resting his heavy elbows on his knees, staring quietly into the dancing flames. "It is completely over," he said softly, deliberately not looking back at her so she would not feel trapped by his predatory gaze. "The traitorous faction has fully surrendered their weapons. You are entirely safe now, Emily. I swear to you, no one will ever hurt you again within the borders of my territory." Emily slowly loosened her desperate, white-knuckled grip on the velvet blankets. She crawled forward silently on the massive mattress until she was sitting right behind his broad, immovable back. She could clearly see the deep, faded white scars of past, brutal battles crisscrossing his warm skin in the high-contrast lighting of the room. Without thinking about the immense danger of touching an alpha, she reached out. Her small, incredibly delicate hand gently touched his powerful, tensed shoulder. Ethan's entire massive body locked up rigidly at the sudden, unexpected contact, but he did not pull away from her warmth. "You just fought an entire armed army for a lowly servant," she whispered, her voice thick and heavy with unshed, overwhelming tears. "Why would you risk your own crown for me?" He finally turned his handsome head to look back at her. His glowing amber eyes were entirely stripped of their previous coldness and violent rage. In the fading, dramatic light of the fire, he looked tired, surprisingly vulnerable, and fiercely, undeniably devoted. "Because you are no longer a servant in this castle," he replied, his deep, resonant voice wrapping around her trembling heart like a warm, protective blanket. "You are mine to protect, and I will burn this entire kingdom to the ground before I let anyone take you from me." The morning sun breached the heavy stone mullions of the Alpha King's private chambers, casting long, sharp beams of golden light across the dark oak floor. Emily stirred beneath the heavy velvet blankets, momentarily disoriented by the luxurious, enveloping warmth. She was completely accustomed to the freezing, drafty servant quarters, waking long before dawn to the harsh shouts of the head housekeeper. Today, however, the only sound was the quiet, rhythmic crackle of the dying hearth and the steady breathing of the most powerful man in the Northern Territories. Ethan was already awake. He stood by the towering arched window, fully dressed in fresh dark leather armor that perfectly accentuated his broad, intensely muscular shoulders. The harsh, high-contrast morning light caught the sharp angles of his face and the impeccably neat cut of his short dark hair. He turned his head as she slowly sat up, his glowing amber eyes softening instantly from their usual predatory intensity. Resting on the carved wooden chest at the foot of the massive bed was a carefully folded gown of deep forest green wool, beautifully lined with soft winter fur. It was definitely not a maid's uniform, nor was it the overly ostentatious, impractical silk of the scheming nobility. It was warm, respectful, and carried the unmistakable, powerful scent of the royal household. "Put that on," Ethan said quietly, his deep, resonant voice wrapping around her trembling heart like a physical embrace. "The dark days of you wearing threadbare cotton and scrubbing freezing stone floors are permanently over. Today, you walk out of this room directly under my personal banner." Emily gently touched the fine, soft fabric, her fiercely resilient spirit warring with a fresh wave of terrifying anxiety. "Ethan, if I dress in the official colors of the royal household, the pack will see it as a direct and insulting challenge. Victoria's aristocratic family is already calling for blood outside these walls. What happens when the rest of the fierce kingdom realizes you are intentionally elevating a lowly human servant?" "Let them look," he replied smoothly, crossing the vast room with those long, powerful strides until he stood right beside the bed. He reached out, his rough, heavily scarred fingers lightly and reverently brushing her pale cheek. "I am the reigning king. I do not ever ask for permission to protect what is rightfully mine. But we are about to face a bitter storm, Emily. My loyal beater has just informed me through the mind link that the Council of Elders has gathered in the lower stone hall. They are aggressively demanding a formal explanation for Victoria's sudden imprisonment, and they are demanding to interrogate the human girl who supposedly bewitched their alpha. He knelt slightly, gracefully lowering his massive bulk to ensure he was exactly at her eye level, his towering frame easily blocking out the harsh morning glare. I can leave you here in absolute safety. I can lock the heavy iron door, post my most lethal and trusted guards, and handle the furious elders entirely myself. You do not ever have to face their snapping teeth. Emily looked deeply into his fierce, golden eyes. She saw the absolute, unwavering sincerity in his offer, and the profound, desperate desire to shield her from the brutal, bloody politics of his kind. But she also knew with absolute certainty that if she hid away now, she would forever be seen as a weak, manipulative coward, a dangerous liability to the incredible man who had risked everything for her. She took a deep, steadying breath, forcefully pushing past the ingrained terror of a lifetime of quiet servitude. Her delicate, beautiful features hardened with a quiet, undeniable strength that rivaled any seasoned warrior. No, Emily said firmly, lifting her chin with a newfound, breathtaking dignity. I will not cower like a frightened mouse in your bedroom while you face the heavy fallout of my actions. I threw that poisoned goblet. I directly accused the Luna. I will stand proudly by your side and tell them exactly what I saw with my own eyes. A slow, immensely proud, and undeniably possessive smile spread across Ethan's handsome, hardened face. He stood up to his full, terrifying height, offering her his large, calloused hand with absolute respect. When they finally descended the grand marble staircase together a short time later, the heavy silence that fell over the cavernous council room was absolute and suffocating. The ancient, heavily scarred elders sat rigidly around a massive circular stone table, their glowing eyes flashing with immediate, unbridled hostility at the shocking sight of the young, beautiful human woman walking directly beside their fearsome king. The eldest of them, a withered man with cold, unforgiving grey eyes, slammed his heavy wooden walking staff sharply against the stone floor. Alpha Ethan? You dare bring the human whelp into the sacred council room? She is officially accused of high treason and malicious deceit. She absolutely belongs rotting in the dark dungeons, not draped comfortably in royal wool. Ethan's posture instantly shifted into terrifying, aggressive dominance, a lethal rumble starting deep in his broad chest, but Emily placed a gentle, grounding hand on his muscular forearm. She bravely stepped forward, deliberately placing her fragile body between the furious, powerful elders and the king's rising, bloody wrath. I am no traitor, elder, Emily spoke, her voice ringing out clearly and beautifully in the cavernous room without a single tremor of fear. I am the only reason your Alpha King still draws breath this morning. You constantly pride yourselves on the ancient honor of the wolf, yet you willingly turn a blind eye when your Luna resorts to the pathetic cowardice of poison. I may not possess razor-sharp claws or lethal fangs, but I did not hesitate for a second to risk my own human life to save the Alpha who fiercely protects this territory. Ask yourselves who the real, dangerous enemy of the pack is today. The sheer audacity and burning truth of her words struck the tense room like a physical blow. The ancient elders stared at her, genuinely stunned into silence by the pure iron will radiating from such a fragile, beautiful creature. Beside her, Ethan looked down at the young woman, his massive heart swelling with an emotion far deeper, more primal, and infinitely more dangerous than simple desire. She was not just desperately surviving his brutal world, she was fiercely commanding it. The cold grey eyes of the lead elder narrowed dangerously, assessing the young human with a newfound, highly grudging respect. Bold, arrogant words for a fragile creature who could be snapped in half with a single, careless bite, the elder hissed, though the venom in his gravelly tone had noticeably thinned. But pretty words are merely wind. You accuse Luna Victoria of utilizing concentrated wolfsbane, a lethal substance strictly banned within these fortress walls for centuries. If you are lying to us, human, the mandated punishment is a slow, agonizing death. Are you truly prepared to stake your fragile life on this wild, dangerous accusation? Emily did not flinch or look away from his terrifying gaze. She felt the heavy, radiating heat of Ethan standing right behind her, an immovable mountain of muscle and lethal instinct. His looming presence was a silent, terrifying vow of absolute protection to anyone who dared touch her, but she knew she had to decisively win this specific battle on her own terms. "I do not speak out of malice, nor do I seek political power," she answered, her voice incredibly steady, echoing powerfully off the ancient stone walls. "I seek only the absolute truth. Examine the ruined, burned stones in the Great Hall. Let your most trusted healers test the remaining toxic residue in the shattered chalice. The undeniable evidence of her dark betrayal is literally burned into the very foundation of this castle. I stand proudly by my Alpha, and I will gladly face any rigorous trial you propose, because I have absolutely nothing to hide from the light." Ethan stepped fully up beside her, his massive, leather-clad shoulder brushing lightly against hers, presenting a united, unbreakable, and utterly terrifying front to the stunned council of wolves. The heavy oak doors of the great hall groaned open, revealing the scorched devastation from the previous night's terrifying climax. The Council of Elders, flanked tightly by their elite guards, marched toward the royal dais with grim expressions. Emily walked calmly beside Alpha Ethan, her slender hand resting lightly but securely on his heavily muscular forearm. The harsh, high-contrast light from the massive stained-glass windows illuminated the horrific, blackened crater etched deep into the ancient stone floor. The acrid, sickening stench of burned wolfsbane and melted silver still hung heavily in the freezing air, acting as a potent phantom reminder of the lethal betrayal that had almost claimed their king. The royal healer, an ancient and blind wolf whose sensory perception was utterly legendary across the treacherous northern territories, hobbled forward from the shadows. He knelt precariously by the violently scorched stone, his gnarled, scarred hands hovering just inches above the chemical burn. He took a slow, incredibly deep breath, his milky white eyes widening instantly in absolute, unadulterated horror. "Highly concentrated northern wolfsbane," the healer rasped, his gravelly voice trembling fiercely with both disbelief and ancient fury. "Mixed perfectly with liquid silver. This is definitely not a chaotic, desperate concoction thrown together by a frightened amateur. This is a highly refined, weaponized poison designed specifically to instantly liquefy an alpha's internal organs. The human girl speaks the absolute, undeniable truth to this council. Luna Victoria has committed the highest, most unforgivable form of treason against the crown." A deafening, chaotic uproar instantly erupted among the gathered council of elders. The very same men who had arrogantly demanded Emily's execution mere moments ago were now violently howling for Victoria's immediate, bloody demise. The absolute sanctity of the royal bloodline had been fundamentally violated by the one aristocratic woman sworn to fiercely protect it. Ethan simply raised a single, battle-scarred hand, and the cavernous hall plunged instantly back into a terrifying, obedient silence. "The evidence is completely irrefutable," Ethan declared, his deep voice carrying the cold, merciless weight of a heavy executioner's blade. "Victoria of the Eastern Ridge is hereby permanently stripped of her title, her pack status, and her royal protection. Prepare the ancient blood seals in the deep inner sanctum immediately. I will formally sever the sacred mating bond and sign her final death warrant." The lead elder bowed his head in deep, terrified submission. "It absolutely requires your physical presence in the deep vaults, Alpha. The complex blood magic of the severing ritual cannot be interrupted by anyone. The human must remain behind during the casting." Ethan's square jaw clenched tightly, a dangerous, lethal rumble vibrating heavily in his broad chest. "She does not leave my sight for a single second." "Ethan, it is all right," Emily whispered softly, stepping slightly in front of his massive frame to catch his attention. She looked up directly into his fiercely protective amber eyes. "You must finish this formally and legally, or her powerful family will aggressively claim the execution was unlawful and start a civil war. Place me safely in your private study. Surround the room with your most lethal, trusted guards. I will be completely safe there for a few minutes. Ethan fiercely hated the idea with every primal instinct he possessed, but his sharp, tactical mind knew she was absolutely right. He personally escorted her up the spiraling stone stairs to the heavy, iron-reinforced door of his private study. He immediately stationed a dozen of his most elite, heavily armed warriors in the tight corridor, leaving strict, terrifying orders to slaughter absolutely anyone who even breathed too heavily near the locked entrance. I will return before the hearth fire burns down to mere embers, Ethan promised, pressing a devastatingly gentle, lingering kiss against her forehead. The soft, reverent touch was a shocking, beautiful contrast to the brutal, impending violence he was about to unleash upon his traitorous wife. Emily sat completely alone in the massive leather chair behind his sprawling mahogany desk. The room was deeply bathed in the warm, high-contrast glow of the roaring fireplace, casting deep, protective shadows into the far, high corners of the vaulted ceiling. She finally let out a long, shuddering breath, the immense, taxing adrenaline of the entire morning finally beginning to crash over her fragile body. She had miraculously survived the harsh counsel. The pure truth had finally won. But a sudden, unnaturally icy draft violently swept through the securely locked room, extinguishing the thick wax candles in an absolute instant. Emily froze instantly. The fine hair on the back of her pale neck stood straight up in pure alarm. The heavy iron door had definitely not opened, yet she was undeniably no longer alone in the dark space. A low, incredibly wet snarl echoed menacingly from the darkest corner of the high stone ceiling. Victoria's wealthy family was impossibly rich and ancient. They clearly possessed dark, highly forbidden magics that could easily bypass ordinary physical guards stationed outside. A monstrous, heavily mutated rogue wolf dropped silently from the heavy wooden rafters. Its eyes were completely black, totally devoid of any soul or sanity, bound entirely by a lethal, driving blood curse. It had one single, suicidal mission permanently burned into its rotting brain: assassinate the fragile human girl who had single-handedly ruined the Eastern Ridge's desperate bid for the Silver Throne. The terrifying beast lunged forward with blinding, unnatural speed. Emily did not scream, and she absolutely did not freeze in helpless terror. The brutal, unforgiving survival instincts she had perfectly honed over years of invisible, harsh servitude kicked in flawlessly. She dove violently sideways, rolling harshly across the rough stone floor just as the monster's massive, foaming jaws snapped shut on the heavy leather chair, tearing the thick furniture to absolute shreds. Emily scrambled frantically to her feet, her desperate, wide eyes scanning the dimly lit room for any advantage. She quickly grabbed the heaviest object within her immediate reach, the solid, ornate silver candelabra resting on a side table. As the feral, mutated wolf quickly recovered its footing and sprang directly toward her exposed throat, she swung the heavy silver weapon with absolutely every ounce of strength in her small, human body. The pure metal smashed brutally against the beast's sensitive snout. The sickening sizzle of instantly burning flesh and a deafening, agonized howl completely filled the enclosed, echoing space. She knew perfectly well she could not fight it to the death. She only needed to survive just long enough to alert the guards outside. She frantically grabbed a heavy iron poker from the roaring fireplace and smashed it violently against the massive stained glass window, shattering the ancient, thick glass into 1,000 glittering, falling pieces. The explosive, violent sound of shattering glass finally alerted the elite guards stationed heavily outside the thick, aggressively soundproofed door. Before the desperate guards could even attempt to breach the heavy lock, the thick iron door was literally ripped completely off its massive steel hinges from the outside corridor. Alpha Ethan stood terrifyingly in the ruined doorway, acting as an avatar of pure, unfiltered destruction. He had sharply felt her sudden, massive spike of pure terror through the lingering, possessive scent mark he had left on her delicate skin. He did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. He crossed the large room in a terrifying blur of blinding speed, his large, battle-scarred hands wrapping violently and securely around the mutated wolf's thick throat. With a single, brutally efficient twist, he cleanly snapped the massive beast's neck, tossing the heavy, lifeless carcass aside against the wall like completely discarded, worthless trash. Ethan dropped instantly to his knees on the ruined floor, pulling Emily fiercely and desperately into his broad, muscular chest. He was trembling violently. The absolutely invincible, terrifying northern warlord was physically shaking with the horrific, paralyzing realization of exactly how close he had come to permanently losing her. Emily buried her pale face deep into his warm, heavily scarred neck, her slender arms wrapping tightly and securely around his wide, tense shoulders, perfectly anchoring the violent, raging beast back to his fragile humanity. "I have you," he whispered fiercely into her dark hair, his glowing amber eyes burning intensely with a lethal, absolute promise of total warfare. No more trials. No more endless politics. Tonight, her entire treacherous bloodline completely burns to the ground. The storm that Alpha Ethan unleashed upon the Eastern Ridge Loyalists was not a battle, it was a swift and terrifying execution. He left Emily heavily guarded in the ruined study, his massive, heavily muscular frame disappearing into the freezing, shadowed corridors of the ancient fortress. Outside, the high-contrast lighting of roaring watchfires illuminated the dark winter snow, casting long, demonic shadows across the courtyard. Ethan did not bother to shift into his monstrous wolf form. Clad in his dark leather armor, his short dark hair whipped violently by the biting wind, he waded directly into the desperately gathered rebel forces. His silver broadsword was an extension of his own primal fury, a blinding arc of deadly precision that dismantled the treasonous guard with terrifying, systematic efficiency. He was the undisputed warlord of the Northern Territories, and tonight, he violently reminded the entire kingdom exactly why his bloodline ruled the frozen peaks. The rebellion was completely crushed into the bloody snow before the midnight bells could even toll. Leaving his loyal beater to secure the trembling, surrendered survivors, Ethan strode purposefully toward the isolated high tower where Victoria was confined. The heavy iron door groaned as he forced it open, stepping into the freezing, circular stone room. Victoria sat huddled in the corner, her previously flawless aristocratic facade now completely shattered by raw terror as she looked at the blood-soaked Alpha King. Ethan did not offer a single word of mercy or explanation. He drew a small, ancient obsidian dagger from his belt and sliced a deep line across his own broad palm. The complex, forbidden blood magic of the severing ritual demanded heavy sacrifice and absolute intent. As his glowing amber eyes locked onto the terrified woman who had attempted to murder him, he spoke the ancient, guttural incantations of the pack law. The air in the room violently warped and crackled with unseen energy, and with a sickening, visceral snap that echoed deep within the soul of every wolf in the castle, the sacred mating bond was permanently severed. Victoria screamed in sudden, agonizing psychic pain, collapsing to the stone floor as a completely powerless, exiled rogue. Meanwhile, back in the dim, violently wrecked confines of the private study, Emily did not cower or weep. The adrenaline had long since faded, leaving behind a cold, absolute clarity that she had cultivated over years of harsh, invisible servitude. She looked at the massive, lifeless carcass of the mutated assassin wolf lying in the high-contrast shadows. Instead of being paralyzed by the horrific sight, her profoundly resilient spirit took over. She found a relatively clean piece of heavy linen and quietly wiped the freezing sweat and faint splatters of monster blood from her pale face. She carefully gathered the shattered pieces of the silver candelabra, neatly placing them on the ruined desk. She was young, beautiful, and physically fragile compared to the beasts that surrounded her, but her soul was forged from pure iron. She understood that in this brutal world of fangs and shifting allegiances, panic was a luxury she simply could not afford. She sat straight-backed in the only remaining solid wooden chair, her dark eyes fixed entirely on the heavy doorway, waiting patiently for the only man who mattered. The first faint, Grey light of the approaching dawn was just beginning to filter through the shattered stained glass window when the heavy barricade outside the door was finally moved. Alpha Ethan stepped into the room. He was a terrifying vision of pure carnage, his leather tunic torn and heavily stained with the dark blood of his enemies, his massive chest heaving slowly from the exertion of the brutal purge. Yet, the instant his glowing amber eyes found Emily sitting calmly amidst the horrific wreckage, the lethal, predatory tension completely bled out of his broad shoulders. He crossed the ruined stone floor in 3 long strides, falling heavily to his knees right before her. For the first time in his long, brutal life, the invincible Alpha King did not care about masking his profound vulnerability. "It is done," Ethan rasped, his deep voice thick with exhaustion and raw, overwhelming emotion. "The bond is permanently severed. The Eastern Ridge threat is entirely eliminated, and their leaders are chained in the deep dungeons. There is absolutely no one left in this entire kingdom who possesses the power to challenge your right to stand by my side." He reached out with his large, blood-stained hands, stopping just inches from her delicate skin, suddenly hyper-aware of his own savage state. But Emily did not flinch or pull away. She reached out with her small, incredibly soft hands and firmly grasped his rough, scarred fingers, pulling them gently but forcefully against her warm cheek. The stark visual contrast between the monstrous, blood-soaked warlord and the pure, radiant resilience of the young woman anchored the chaotic room in perfect, undeniable harmony. "I never doubted you for a single second," Emily whispered softly, her dark eyes shining with a fierce, unwavering loyalty that burned brighter than any ancient magic. Ethan let out a shuddering breath, standing up to his full, towering height and pulling her effortlessly up with him. He did not ask her to hide or wash away the ash of the night. He wrapped his heavy, protective arm securely around her slender waist and led her out of the ruined study, walking directly through the heavily crowded corridors of the castle. They stepped out onto the Grand Lord's balcony just as the golden winter sun fully breached the jagged mountain peaks. Below them, the massive courtyard was entirely packed with the surviving elders, the elite royal guard, and thousands of pack members who had gathered in absolute, terrified silence. Ethan stood proudly at the carved stone railing, his short dark hair catching the morning light, presenting the young human woman to his savage world. He did not offer a political speech or a diplomatic explanation. He simply pulled Emily tightly against his massively muscular chest, leaned his head back, and let out a deafening, earth-shattering alpha roar that resonated with absolute, unchallenged dominance. The message was instantly and universally understood by every single wolf present. She was not a servant, she was not a fragile human, and she was certainly not a passing amusement. She was the absolute heart of the king, and her word was now the undisputed law of the Silver Peak Pack. The deafening cheers and triumphant howls of the Silver Peak Pack eventually faded into a respectful, distant hum as Alpha Ethan led Emily away from the towering lord's balcony. He did not take her back to the ruined study, the blood-stained courtyard, or the crowded grand halls filled with bowing aristocratic lords. Instead, his large, incredibly warm hand remained securely wrapped around hers, guiding her silently up a hidden, winding stone staircase that led to the very highest pinnacle of the ancient fortress. They stepped through a heavy, iron-wrought door, and entered a breathtaking, completely unexpected sanctuary. It was a massive, glass-domed greenhouse, serving as a stark and profoundly beautiful contrast to the brutal, grey stone and freezing northern snow of the outside world. Exotic, vibrant winter blooms thrived lushly in the perfectly humid air, entirely bathed in the intense, high-contrast golden light of the mid-morning sun that poured directly through the crystal ceiling. Emily stopped dead in the center of the lush greenery, completely overwhelmed by the profound, alien peace of the hidden room. For the past grueling 24 hours, she had miraculously survived deadly poison, toxic political treason, a monstrous magical assassination attempt, and a ruthless, bloody purge. Now, standing entirely safe in the tranquil, golden warmth, the massive, crushing weight of her lifelong, brutal survival finally caught up to her. The absolute, terrifying necessity to always remain invisible, the constant, paralyzing fear of a harsh beating for a spilled bucket of water, and the quiet, soul-crushing desperation of a lowly servant's life all crashed down upon her fragile shoulders at once. A single, silent tear of pure emotional exhaustion slipped down her pale cheek, catching the radiant sunlight perfectly before it fell. Ethan was instantly there. The towering, heavily muscular warlord moved with the quiet, breathless grace of a hunting shadow, stopping just inches before her trembling frame. His neatly trimmed short dark hair caught the bright golden rays, miraculously softening the harsh, violent, and battle-hardened angles of his handsome face. He did not arrogantly pull her into a crushing, dominant embrace, nor did he offer empty, useless platitudes about forgetting the painful past. Instead, he slowly and deliberately dropped to one knee on the damp, fragrant earth of the greenhouse. It was an act of absolute, unimaginable submission from a fiercely proud, reigning alpha king. He reached out with his massive, heavily scarred hands, gently taking her small, trembling fingers into his own warm, rough palms. For your entire, beautiful life within these freezing walls, you have been brutally forced to look down, Ethan said softly. His deep, resonant voice vibrated with a raw, painful honesty that seemed to shake the very glass above them. You were harshly taught to hide your youth, your stunning beauty, and your incredible, iron resilience just to merely survive the routine cruelty of my blind court. I was completely ignorant to the toxic rot festering in my own home, and I was inexcusably blind to the brightest, most courageous soul living right in my own dark shadows. He slowly reached into the small leather pouch strapped securely to his heavy war belt and retrieved a heavy, ancient ring. It was absolutely nothing like the ostentatious, aggressively jeweled, and cursed trinkets that Victoria had proudly paraded around the castle to flaunt her stolen wealth. This was the true, ancient, and deeply revered seal of the Silver Peak Pack, a stunning, solid piece of pure, glowing moonstone set flawlessly in unpolished, heavy northern silver. It was heavy, undeniable, and radiated a faint, warm, comforting magic that resonated perfectly with Emily's pure, untainted spirit. I am not just offering you my absolute, impenetrable physical protection, Emily, Ethan continued, looking fiercely and devotedly up into her dark, tear-filled eyes. The intense, high-contrast light cast heroic shadows across his broad, immovable shoulders. Protection is simply what a wealthy master graciously gives to a loyal servant. I am giving you my true power. I am giving you my undivided, eternal loyalty. You are the sole reason I still possess a beating heart and a kingdom to rule today. From this exact, defining moment forward, you will never, ever have to shrink yourself down to fit into the dark, freezing corners of this brutal world again. With agonizing, breathless care, the massively strong alpha gently slid the ancient moonstone ring onto her delicate, pale finger. It was a perfect, seamless, and completely natural fit, as if the ancient magic of the wolves had been patiently waiting for her arrival for centuries. The heavy, cool silver quickly warmed against her skin, feeling exactly like a grounding, unbreakable anchor. Emily let out a soft, shuddering breath, her fiercely independent and deeply scarred heart finally surrendering entirely to the profound, unwavering security this incredible man offered. She reached down without hesitation, her soft hands gripping his incredibly broad, heavily muscled shoulders, and gently but firmly urged the giant warrior to stand up. When Ethan rose smoothly to his full, terrifying height, the physical difference between them was absolutely staggering, yet the deep emotional balance between their souls was perfectly, beautifully equal. The harsh, high-contrast shadows of the exotic greenhouse leaves danced gracefully across his scarred chest as he finally wrapped his strong, heavy arms securely around her slender waist. He pulled her flush against his massive frame, burying his face gently into the crook of her neck. Emily rested her head against the steady, thunderous rhythm of his heart, breathing in the intoxicating, incredibly safe scent of wild winter pine and deep, eternal devotion. The brutalized, terrified girl who silently scrubbed the freezing floors was officially dead and gone. In her exact place stood a deeply loved, universally respected equal, firmly holding the absolute heart and soul of the most dangerous, powerful predator in the entire North. The brutal, unforgiving winter of the Northern Territories finally broke, yielding to a vibrant and fiercely blooming spring. Emily sat gracefully at the head of the massive, circular stone table in the great hall. The room was bathed in the warm, high-contrast golden sunlight streaming through the newly repaired stained glass windows, driving out the ancient, lingering shadows of the fortress. She no longer wore the threadbare, freezing cotton of a frightened servant. Dressed in the elegant, deep forest green wool of the royal household, the heavy moonstone ring of the Silver Peak pack rested securely and naturally on her delicate finger. The ancient council of elders, the very same men who had once demanded her immediate and bloody execution, now stood before her with their heads bowed in profound, undeniable submission. She was reading aloud the newly established pack laws. Her clear, steady voice echoed off the ancient stones, instituting revolutionary decrees that strictly prohibited the abuse of human servants and guaranteed basic protections and winter provisions for the weakest members of the sprawling territory. Her profoundly resilient spirit, forged in the darkest, coldest corners of the castle, was now actively reshaping the entire soul of the kingdom. Alpha Ethan stood immovable directly behind her carved wooden chair, a silent, terrifying, and deeply devoted guardian. His heavily muscular frame and neatly cut short dark hair cast a reassuring, protective shadow over her slender shoulders. He watched the young, beautiful woman with glowing amber eyes filled with such intense, raw pride that it made the fierce northern warlord look completely, astonishingly at peace. He did not mind sharing his absolute power. In fact, he reveled in the undeniable strength and grace with which she wielded it. When the lengthy council meeting finally concluded and the heavy oak doors closed behind the departing lords, the room fell into a comfortable, intimate quiet. Ethan stepped forward, his massive, calloused hands gently resting on her shoulders. He leaned down, pressing a soft, lingering kiss to the crown of her dark hair. "You have completely changed the very foundation of this frozen world, my brave girl," Ethan murmured, his deep, rumbling voice vibrating pleasantly against her skin. "They do not just fear the king's wrath anymore. They genuinely respect the queen's wisdom." Emily smiled, turning her head to look up at the towering man who had risked his own life and crown to save hers. She stood up, easily closing the physical distance between them, and rested her soft hands against his broad, battle-scarred chest. She could feel the steady, thunderous rhythm of his heart beating perfectly in time with her own. "We changed it together," she replied softly, her dark eyes shining with a fierce, unwavering devotion that rivaled any ancient magic. He wrapped his heavy arms securely around her waist, lifting her slightly off the floor as he captured her lips in a deep, breathtaking kiss. In the stark, beautiful morning light of the north, the invincible beast and his reigning queen stood completely united. The terrifying night of the poisoned chalice was finally reduced to a fading whisper of the past, leaving behind an unbreakable testament to the sheer, world-altering power of love and redemption. From an unknown invisible maid wiping the ground on a cold slate, to the legendary queen who made the entire Wolf clan elders bow down and rewrite the Iron Blood law with wisdom, Emily, with her resilience and courage, completely conquered the strongest and most affectionate Wolf King in the north. Faced with Ethan's absolute preference for "I'd rather burn the entire kingdom to ashes for you," or Emily's clear and powerful counterattack against the assassin with a pure silver candlestick in hand at a critical moment, which plot most shocked or moved you? If you were to write it, what kind of sweet anime would you most like to see from them next? Welcome to leave your thoughts in the comments section. Don't forget to like and follow us. See you in the next treasure story.